A lot of times you talk about when you're in a state of survival, you can't be introspective. And on the one hand, I see where you're going and it's very valuable teaching. But on the other hand, my view is that we're always in a state of survival because that's how our brain evolved to work, that we
Yes.
naturally make everything into a life or death situation. The example I always use is a bad hair day has life or death significance because you attached your appearance to your social acceptability when you were young. And then your mammal brain attaches your social acceptability to the survival of your genes. And
Hmm.
so when you think you don't look good for some minute little reason, your survival chemicals are triggered.
Yes.
And if you say, well, I can't be introspective while I'm in a survival state, but if you're always in a survival state, then you're never going to be introspective.
Yeah.
So, but so then what I always say is that the cortisol lasts in your body for an hour. And when
Hmm.
the hour is over, that's a better time
Yes.
to look into it.
Yeah.
However, by that hour, something else is likely to trigger you. So you
Exactly.
really have to make a date with yourself to be willing to look into these roots of your responses that are sort of uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think that's one misinterpretation that happens for me a lot, especially when clients are like, how do I get rid of this? I'm like, that's not the point of this. If you want to get rid of that survival instinct, like you have to remove that part of your brain. Like there's a purpose for it. We need it. It's kept us alive for this long. And like you said, yeah, like that's one thing I explain to people too. It's like, it's interesting how biologically speaking, like if you see a deer out in the woods after it just outran a tiger, like you give that time for the body to regulate and it goes back to its day as if nothing's happened. Like it'll just go back to eating and drinking. Like we have actual footage of
Because they don't have a big cortex, but the human big cortex can create the threat when
yes,
it's not immediately
correct,
present. So you say, whoa, if that bad thing happened, imagine what other bad things can
exactly.
happen. And you
We
go
can
down that
stew
rabbit.
on it
Yes.
and we're not regulating anymore because we're staying in a prolonged state of stress. And that's the fascinating thing about the human, because our frontal lobe is 40% of our brain, right? Like it's the biggest ratio compared to any other species, while the deer is going there as if nothing's happened. It's like, oh, I'm going to go about my day. But it's interesting because the question for me was, wait, hold on, does that mean humans have the same ability? And that's kind of when I realized, if yes, we do, we can shorten that refractory period. Like it's a muscle that you can flex. It comes with practice, right? And doing it again and again and again and developing neural pathways. But that's what I realized. That's what emotional intelligence is.
Yeah, yeah. Our cortex connects to our body through the mammal brain, through the
Yes.
limbic system. So until you get your inner mammal on board and it releases the go chemical, you're
Yeah,
not going to do it. So that's
exactly.
why all of these people intellectualize and spend their whole life with woulda, coulda, shoulda and don't do anything because, and the simple solution I always say is we have two brains because we need both.
Yes.
And you can't just use your intellectual brain and say, well, I know this and I'm going to be this kind of person, because often that leads to lying to yourself. Because again, with your filter, you can find the information that says, yes, I'm this kind of person, but what you're actually doing is quite different. And it's just easy to just ignore that. So we have to use our two brains together instead of thinking that our mammal brain is the bad guy and the human cortex is
There,
the good
yeah,
guy.
that's the whole aha, isn't it? Is
Yeah.
there is no bad guy. They're meant to work
Yeah.
together, right? Your limbic brain, your cortex, they're meant to work together, because one of the things that often happen, like you're saying, when we're intellectualizing things too much, that's actually a survival tactic for some people. If you ever seen like the stereotypical guy-girl relationship, right? Girls trying to share her feelings, be seen, felt, and heard with their limbic brain, but the guy's so uncomfortable, he's trying to fix the problem. Have you tried this? Have you done that? And the girl's like, can you just shut up and listen to me? I think for example, one of the theories that I feel like I agree with is just like, for a lot of men, we have a perspective about what it means to be masculine. Growing up, we're told, be tough, don't cry, don't show your emotions. And because we feel like this limbic brain is not a good thing, right? These emotions we're feeling aren't good. We don't know how to regulate. We literally react to it with our intellect and we try to fix the problem. It doesn't help that society is a logically dominant society too. We don't get paid for what we feel, we get paid for what we know, right? Like logically how to do. So it's interesting because I agree with you, because when we're in a survival state of survival, we literally have research now that shows how compartmentalized your brain gets. They're not working with each other. They kind of like compartmentalize and silo off. But like you said, it's just like it's meant to be comprehensive, right? Integrated. Our whole brain
Yes.
is meant to be
Yes.
integrated. Yeah.
And when you're in a state of survival, you can't just say, well, I can't do anything. It's not my fault. I'm in a state of survival. But you're making the point that you're in that state in your own brain, and it's your own challenge and task to create a different state in your brain rather than say,
Correct.
whoop, not my fault. I can't do anything. I'm in a,
Exactly.
yeah.
Blaming is a survival tactic. It's your brain going, I don't want to take ownership of this uncomfortable feeling. At least I can blame it on somebody else. And
Yes.
I think that's where people who go through therapy, if they stay in that victimized kind of mindset, they never grow, because what they're doing, it's like this. It's like the friends calling you out. Hey, you got to see someone. This is toxic behavior. They go to the therapist. Therapist might tell you, hey, at 5 years old, this trauma happened to you. That's why you behave this way. Person in the victimized state of survival will go, oh, that makes so much sense. Thank you so much. They go back to their friends, do the same toxic behavior. And when the friend questions them, they go, you know why I do this? It's because my therapist told me when I was 5 years old. So that's like
Exactly.
a blaming, victimized kind of mentality. But isn't it
Exactly.
interesting how some people who go through trauma overcome and change, right? And start helping people versus the other one that stays in self-destructive behavior. No judgment around it, but
Yeah.
it's this question
Yeah.
of how they view things. Yeah.
And the brain is always learning from rewards. And so
Mm,
the minute blaming works for you and gets a
yes.
reward, then you build the pathway that says, oh, wow, that's how to solve
Yeah.
problems, by blaming them on someone else.
And now you
Whereas
always
a
do it
person,
without thinking.
yeah,
It just becomes
whereas,
second nature. Yeah.
yeah, whereas a person who might have had a bigger trauma, but they move on because they had no one to rescue them. So they didn't learn to expect a rescue. They learned to put one foot in front of another and find a solution and then deal with the next problem.
Absolutely.
And I just want to also mention about what you said about the stereotypical male female thing, not to just blame males, but so the stereotypical female perspective has its own problems,
Yes.
which is that so to put it in a cliche term is, I want to feel heard.
Yeah.
So when you feel heard, well, that's the child perspective, because when a child is heard, somebody else fixes the problem.
Mm,
And it's natural to want that, because if you think of like in caveman times, the mother was out foraging and she put the baby down, and then she found maybe a piece of fruit here and there, and maybe it's like, oh, where did I put the baby? So the baby's ability to scream and be heard, or a toddler who wanders off, their ability to scream and be heard was a huge survival mechanism.
mm.
And yet in adult life, you could make your whole life like, I want all my friends to hear me, and I want my partner to hear me, and I want my kids to hear. And that becomes an end in itself. And you don't really take responsibility for solving your problems, because
Yeah.
being heard becomes the end in itself. And as you said about therapy, can reinforce that mindset.
Yes. Yes. 100%. I love this conversation. I'm having a lot of fun.
Thank you. Me too. Me
Yeah.
too. But I think I've gotten my whole agenda here of all the issues. Just in case people don't know, this book, Gut Feelings, I'm referring to in this classic study, was that, and I don't always agree with like every study that comes along, but the
Yeah.
idea they said was that when a person was playing poker and they were trying to hide their emotions, and they were making a decision to take a card or not take a card, that their mammal brain made the decision a split second before they took the action. So to look at the chain between the conscious verbal thought and the action, that you think it's the conscious verbal thought that triggered the action, but actually you triggered it before you had the
Yeah.
thought. And that's the mammal brain. And for my focus, that's the chemical that triggers the action, whether it's a forward action or a retreat action.
Yes. And it's fascinating how the mammal brain does that. It's like if you see a snake out in the wild, like your
Mm-mm-mm.
body's jumping before you tell it to jump,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
So you need that. We need that. And then kind of like I was saying earlier, it's just like, well, is your brain integrated though? Are
Yes,
they,
exactly.
is it communicating with all
Yeah.
parts of the brain?
Yeah. And
Because yeah,
that's a very hard thing to do, because the mammal brain is nonverbal. And
right.
once again,
Exactly.
if not only can we integrate them, but then can we teach our children to integrate them, which is the real challenge that every child faces.
Yeah. 100%. I agree with you.